If they want me, I'm not asking for money.
I don't know. Did they answer you?
I'm reviewing for them papers without asking for anything in return.
But did they answer?
I want to be anonymous. It's my right.
Did they answer you when you did this email? Yeah?
No, right. They do not answer. The last one was from Gait and Posture.
I don't know. It's the new privacy laws, I think.
Yeah.
Everybody.
So I don't know. Well, if it starts coming from journals like Journal of Neurophysiology, Experimental Brain Research, and other places, then I would probably have to give up because
you're going to have to
forced to do it.
I think we do it implicitly, and now they're asking us to do it explicitly. Anyway, I'm going to get some coffee so I can listen and stay awake for Bob.
Yeah, you better get something stronger. If I were you.
Yeah, Bob, where are you? Oh,
my basement. It's like 90 degrees.
Well, it's not 90 degrees yet outside, and it's quite comfortable out as well. It's simply if you are standing on the sun, yes, it is a bit hot. But I took Zhuchka for a 40-minute walk this morning, and she enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it. It wasn't too bad.
That's nice. We can't take Minnie that long anymore. She was just diagnosed with bladder cancer. We're not going to put her through surgery because she's 15.
Of course. It makes no sense, of course.
Yeah. So she doesn't walk very long. But anyhow, no, it's hot down here because there's a dehumidifier that emits heat.
Oh, good.
But I got relegated to the basement, and Eileen gets to work in the rest of the house.
Oh, that's fair.
Which seems fair.
Yeah.
Well, Minnie gets the middle floor, Eileen gets the top floor, and I get the basement. So Minnie and Eileen, of course, get the better places, according to our role in the family.
Were you already asked to fill the return to work very complex document I got one from Kathy Drager, and I already did it. So I asked to give a time schedule when different people will be in the lab so that there is not more than X people per room, per square foot. And of course it is crazy, but they simply want a piece of paper in case someone complains, I guess.
As far as I know, I didn't get that. I might have, because I don't really read anything that comes to me. But especially if it's from anybody from the administration. But
Monica.
Hi, Monica. We do have stuff coming from Hershey there. I have to do.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Richard.
Yes. Of course. Hey, Richard.
Good to see you, Richard.
Hello, it's good to see you all.
Hello.
Shumei actually got her research program up and running to some
Well, to a degree, not completely. Yes, we started doing something, but it's not completely because I get information from my postdoc from Janina there. And yes, they are allowed to do the clinical part. I don't think they're allowed to do their welder project when they invite people from outside, and
Yeah, I've been talking to them about it, and you have to identify your research. Your clinical research is essential, and essential means that it could be of benefit to the participants, which by definition, nobody knows. You're supposed to be agnostic about the benefit, even if it's a clinical trial, but they don't. They just want you to say, yeah, it could be beneficial, so that they could allow you to start up.
No, we're not allowed. We're not allowed to do human experiments yet at Penn State. Main campus. But we're allowed to come to the lab and do nothing.
But only at 25%, right? Occupancy, whatever that means.
I have no idea. No. Well, in our lab, they allowed me to have 4 to 5 people at the same time between the 2 rooms I have. Well, according to square footage, they think that that's good enough, that's sufficient. So that's all right. I mean, I can handle it. Hey, Richard. Hi, Gregor.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Gregor.
Good morning.
Richard.
All right, so we have a few more minutes for others to join, if there will be others. Yeah.
People tell me that sound and image are fine in YouTube and Facebook as well. We are already online.
We are already online, so we should stop cursing and saying politically incorrect things. Okay. So, well, we're waiting still a little bit. We have 2 minutes.
So we've been camping on weekends, and that's something we can do. We've been out of touch. I've missed the Saturday sessions live because of that, but it's a chance to get away from our house, so it's nice.
Hey, Marco.
Hello. Hello. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
How are you, Bob?
All right. How are things down there? Hot? Yeah.
A little, just above 100. Actually, the last couple of days have been pretty good, but last week was 110. So you guys are welcome to visit us anytime.
Well, 110 is a bit much to my liking. We're in low 90s. They promised to be low 90s.
Hi.
Hey, John.
I should come and visit you guys then.
Yeah, you're welcome, of course.
Yeah, you're definitely welcome. There's nobody, there. You're welcome to visit. Matter of fact, this would be the perfect time for you to visit. I'm not going to.
That is true.
It's a nice.
Yeah, we discovered in our stores a very nice Montepulciano d'Abruzzo.
Oh.
Very, very good brand.
Yeah.
Which makes life a little bit sweeter.
We have we're in the 60s here. Like a little cool period.
72 in Amherst. Perfect temperature.
Sounds nice.
Well, I'm jealous.
So, I wonder whether we're waiting for anybody else or we could begin. Luis.
We can begin.
Yeah, okay.
Everything's all ready.
Well, okay, then I'm going to ask everybody to mute your microphones with the exception of our speaker and for 1 minute myself. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Bob Sainburg, a friend and a great colleague here at Penn State. So you now know that motor control related science is done not only in Chicago, Atlanta, but also in State College, which is one of the capitals of motor control, of course. So Bob is going to tell us something about the two parts of the brain we all have, and about the difference between the two parts of the brain we all have, and maybe even something else that I'm unaware of. So Bob, please.
All right, thanks, Mark. I'm going to share my screen. Share. And I'm going to play this. All right, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Oh, should I put up the chat dialogue? Just in case people have questions along the way.
I think the chat will emerge automatically when something is posted there.
Oh, okay.
I guess so.
All right, so I'm going to talk to you about the only thing that I've done with my horrible career, which is to look at how we coordinate the two hemispheres to control movement, something called neurolateralization. I mean, the first thing that's I think important to emphasize is that lateralization is really a fundamental principle of neural organization. It emerged, half a billion years ago with the emergence of animals. The nervous system is not a symmetric organ in terms of function. And it's been, lateralization has been shown across species and across the, what you could think of as the evolutionary spectrum. Another way of saying this is that 4/5 of the brain, everything that's not primary processing, is lateralized to some degree. And what that means is that two homologous regions in the right and left side of the brain have different but related functions. All I did for the picture here was mirror image. So this isn't really, I just did that because I'm lazy. But usually those homologous areas are related in function. The reason is because they have roughly the same intra-hemispheric connections. So there tend to be complementary functions if you look at two homologous areas in the brain. And you might ask, well, why is the brain asymmetric? Why isn't the brain symmetric? And I would show you a picture of my favorite poet, Alexander Pope, who, by the way, if Alex Pope had been born in 20th century New Jersey, he would have fit in very well. I had never, in my formative years, been able to enjoy poetry until I found Alexander. Alexander Pope was called a satirist. What he really was just a cynical person who espoused in a nice way, at least for me from New Jersey, sarcasm. And so, I just think when people say, why not symmetry? I think of his essay on man, presumptuous man, what reason would you find why you are so small and so weak? First, ask the harder question, why aren't you a flea? And that seems similar to this question, why not symmetry? That's the wrong question. The better question is, why symmetry? So why would you have a symmetrical brain? You have all this neural tissue to do a bunch of stuff. Why would you duplicate function? If you don't have to be connected to the fairly symmetrical body or the world with, two sides to it and sensors that sense both those sides. So if you're not dealing with primary or to some degree secondary cortices, then it would be crazy to have symmetry, to use a bunch of neurons to do something here that you're going to do exactly the same thing over here when you don't have to be connected to the periphery. So an example of brain lateralization that everybody's pretty familiar with is language. And we know in the left hemisphere, we store our lexicon or our words and our syntax. And in the right hemisphere, we store or we process our nonverbal aspects to language, what you can think of as emotional. And so when you see this kid and he says to you, this is your kid, and you say, hey, how are you? He says, I'm fine. He has that look on his face. You put the two together, and your right hemisphere is able to interpret the prosody, the emotion, and the left hemisphere, what's being said. And in this case, you're able to pick up the discrepancy and maybe make some judgment about how your evening's going to go with your child in that mood. All right. So what about motor control? Well, there's been, and there still is a prevalent view of motor control, which I've termed global dominance, which is basically the view that we're walking around somewhat hemiparetic, that one side of our brain and our body is just not good. We don't practice with it enough. It's not good at things. And the other one's really good. And it's it's a little odd given the fact that we know that the way the brain works is that when something is not used for one thing, everything gets reorganized to some degree, and it's because of local interactions at the neuronal and synaptic level. Neurons just don't sit around and do nothing. So there's always adaptation, and it seems odd to think of a bad hemisphere and a good hemisphere, but that's really the way that a lot of people think about handedness. We've come up with a bihemispheric model of motor lateralization. I'm going to give you some background to that. A lot of you have seen this crap. Maybe I'll add some stuff that you haven't seen. Where we think that the left hemisphere and the right hand is really good at doing things like predicting the effects of world and internal dynamics, to be able to make whatever trajectories it wants very efficiently, and the left hand and right hemisphere are really good at being able to do things like stabilize through control of what we think of as impedance. And the bihemispheric element to this is that each hemisphere actually contributes both processes to both hands, just that the predominant influence of one hemisphere's control is given to the contralateral hand. And I have ideas about why we might do that, that have more to do with the efficiency of cognitive processes than anything else. But it might just have to do with the connectivity and the asymmetries in connectivity between the periphery and the cortical regions. So I'm going to describe some work that we've done in a setup like I just showed you, which we do planar reaching studies, and we reach from point to point and get feedback with one or two hands. The early work that we did on asymmetry, we just had people reach in different directions, and we saw, at that point, there was a lot of people, and a lot of people up in Canada, Digby Elliott and Richard Carson and Romeo Chua and Pam Bryden, we're all doing all of these studies trying to figure out what are the differences between the limbs, and in terms of control. And at that point, Richard had written, this is the early 90s, Richard Carson had written a bunch of reviews saying every time we find a task that one hand does better, we later find out under those conditions the other hand does better, and we basically can't figure this thing out. And maybe that's a cynical way of putting it, but I think that was basically the state of where things were at the time. And all we did was look at things in a lot higher resolution. And so if you were to look at these very rapid movements to different directions, and you were just to view them with your naked eye, or even if you were just to measure how accurate or how much time it took people to get from A to B. So these were a lot of measures that were done early on in motor control: movement time, reaction time, final position accuracy. You may not see the differences that were very systematic. And those differences are that the non-dominant arm tended to have this very curved motion to get to roughly the same accuracy as the dominant arm. And I guess I should say that here's a measure of deviation from linearity, or what you could think of as curvature. And
Bob, I'm going to interrupt you. Are you scrolling your slides? Because we're only seeing the first one.
Oh no, really?
Yeah.
This is terrible news.
Yeah, we're still on your first slide.
Thank you for interrupting me, because I've been through.
For a moment, I thought you wanted just to use one slide, which is okay with us.
Well, I do, and we're done.
I was very impressed by how well you could give us a talk with the one slide. I was very impressed.
Resume share.
We had this before. It's when you have a separate screen. It might be on the wrong screen.
Well, that's bizarre, because the other screen shouldn't. Let me try something. Then I'll do system preferences. displays.
Would mirroring
When you do a screen share, you have to select the screen you want to share.
Yeah, well, I have one screen that's, the other one is actually off. My laptop is closed. So it's not show mirroring options in the menu bar when available. So I don't actually have that screen on, so I don't have mirroring available. But if I open that, then it should give me mirroring, and we'll see how that goes. Hello. Do I get mirror arrangement? Mirror displays. Okay, so tell me, I'll share this now. Let's go back here. That's terrible. You didn't get the picture of Alex Pope, which was like really important. Share screen. And so, what do I have on here? Gosh. Okay. Oh, this is really... Okay, so you can see my desktop now.
Yes.
You can see your desktop, yes.
I don't want this. I want to go to this. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Slideshow. Now if I do play, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's better. Yes, it worked.
Okay, so we'll go through it. Okay, you with me? That was
You
fast.
can see Angie.
We are.
Okay, so we do a bunch of stuff where we reach, and then ta-da! So this is what I was just talking about. Does anybody want to see any of those earlier slides? They were just they weren't interesting, by the way, but you could see them if you want. There was this nice one of the different species being lateralized. Do you like that? Great. There's Alex Pope, great guy, I guess. Kind of sarcastic. All right. So, okay, this is the early work. We showed that the non-dominant arm tends to make very curved movements, dominant arm very straight movements. Not a lot of difference in...
Maybe at the end, might you be able to share your slides for the YouTube visitors, viewers? Maybe we find some way to do that.
Yes, I can do that. Do you want me just to start over and talk a little bit faster so that, look, I'll do that. I'll do that really quick. So, neural foundations of handedness, I'm going to talk about, or at least what I conceive to be the neural foundations of handedness. We're going to talk about lateralization, handedness, brain lateralization. I'm going to show you a hybrid model where both hemispheres contribute to control of each hand. And then I'm going to give you some information that we did a long time ago and followed up in a recent study that's now in review on deafferented individuals, large fiber sensory neuropathy survivors. And I told you that lateralization is a general principle of vertebrae, and it even looks like now, to a large degree, invertebrate organization. And there's been lots and lots of studies showing lateralization across domains and species throughout the animal kingdom. What's important to note is that basically all tertiary processing areas, which is the majority of the cortex, is lateralized, which means that it doesn't do exactly the same thing in each hemisphere. And if you look at homologous regions or circuits across the right and the left hemispheres, they tend to be related or do complementary things. And of course, the reason is because the intrahemispheric circuits, the input-output of any homologous area from within the hemisphere, for instance, maybe the sensory information it's getting and where it's sending information to, is very similar. So why not symmetry? And this was my stupid joke where I brought up Alexander Pope, saying, hey, wrong question. why symmetry is really the better question. And the answer is you only need symmetry for those regions of the brain that are directly connected, or when I say directly, I don't mean one synapse. I mean that are connected to, receive input from, and send output to the periphery, because we have a relatively symmetric body, and because information comes from the world you can think of the visual system in a fairly symmetric with a fairly symmetric organization. So the prevailing model for brain lateralization for every system except motor is what I've described, where homologous regions contribute complementary functions, and language is probably the most well recognized lateralized system, in which the right hemisphere, the dorsal posterior temporal lobe, functions to interpret and specify prosody features and emotional features of language, and the left hemisphere, similar areas, function to store words and represent syntax, or the rules about how to string words together to make meaning, both interpret and specify. So you have these complementary functions. With motor lateralization, however, the predominant view is that we've got a good hemisphere and a good hand, and a bad hemisphere and a bad hand. And while there's been some proposals that are a little bit more along the complementary lines, nothing has really emerged to the top to figure out, what complementary functions, if that's the organization, might reflect motor lateralization. And this kind of global dominance is the general view that people take in both the scientific and non-scientific communities. Through the work that I'm going to describe to you, we've developed a bihemispheric model of motor lateralization, which fits the complementary system, in which we've done this mostly for reaching movements, or in some cases repetitive movements or cyclic movements. We haven't looked at manipulation movements of the fingers, although some other people have, and sometimes the data differentiate similarly, sometimes they don't for the distal, for the hands and the digits. But our model is that we have something that results in control of trajectory, efficient, smooth movements that seem to be able to be specified in any kind of spatiotemporal organization or profile, and the opposite, non-dominant hand, dominant hemisphere in right-handers, left hemisphere, right hand, we tend to see better posture under unpredictable conditions, which implies to us something like impedance control. And I think the unique feature of this model is that it's a bihemispheric model, so that each hemisphere contributes to both hands. The hemisphere that's contralateral to the hand in question seems to contribute to a greater degree its specialization. And I'll show you a computational simulation, or a couple of them actually, that we've done to kind of approximate what this could look like in terms of control. So I'm going to describe to you some studies in which we reach on air sleds and horizontal plane, so that we can control various features of movement. Yeah.
Because this is kind of summer school, we can start asking questions. So maybe it would be a little bit more specific so that we can understand better what you mean under control of trajectory or control of impedance, because as we know, signals from the brain, do you believe that signals from the brain encode mechanics? Because trajectory sounds like mechanics and impedance sounds like mechanics. So do you believe that these signals encode mechanics, or if they don't, how do you relate it to mechanics?
Sure. So you'll see we have, I'm going to present simulations in which we pretend that the controller that we're calling the trajectory controller encodes mechanics. And we pretend that the other controller specifies stiffness and viscosity. And in this case, it's a simulation of a mechanical system that's not biological. So I can say stiffness and viscosity. What do we think is really going on in terms of encoding these things? I think something kind of, do I think that the nervous system encodes mechanics? I'm not really sure what that means. I'm pretty sure that the nervous system has some kind of circuits where it can anticipate the effects of mechanics. So I'm pretty sure that the studies that Lacquaniti did regarding gravity in space, astronauts predicted terrestrial gravity when balls were dropped to their hands, and they contracted their muscles based on that prediction and slowly adapted to the new gravitational conditions. So I think that we do that. I think that we have some kind of circuits where we specify the effects of dynamics. But do I think that we have the equations of motion represented in the brain? No, if that's what you're asking. And in terms of the actuation mechanism, I don't think it, I think that you can actuate the movement in a whole bunch of different ways, including proportional activation of muscles with descending signals, and something that looks more like the equilibrium point mechanism. And in both cases, you can take account of what might be called expected effects of dynamics. So, I'm kind of agnostic about how much the brain knows about dynamics. Does that help? I know you wanted me to explain that. I know we've talked about
that. All right. It doesn't clarify everything, but I think you made your position more or less clear. So
it doesn't clarify everything, because the real big answer is I don't know.
Yeah, whether this position is defensible, it's another issue. So, but that's for the general discussion, I believe. But at least you made your position clear, so that's good.
All right, good enough. Okay, so we have the non-dominant arm that makes these trajectories that are very curved, the dominant arm that is less curved. Both of them move for this particular task at roughly the same speed. And if we look at the early work in which we looked at the calculation of the link segment dynamics. So, in a two-segment planar system, when you move both arms, you have inertial interactions between the segments. And what we found was that the curvatures of the non-dominant arm varied with the interaction torques, which are the inertial interactions that come from pushing at the ends of one segment with the other, essentially. As though the non-dominant arm, as I was just saying, didn't do a very good job of accounting for those dynamics or the effects of those dynamics, whereas the dominant arm was able to make roughly the same curvature of movements regardless of the effects of those dynamics. And so it looks like one system gets perturbed by its own dynamics and the other system not so much. So we called that, to call it trajectory control is kind of funky because it just so happens that the movements that we're studying, the trajectory is a big part of those movements. But we figured, the dominant arm might have an advantage for trajectory planning, we might call it, execution. There are times when you really want to be able to specify a trajectory if you're drawing something like a circle or whatever. And what about the non-dominant hand? Is there some kind of complementary thing that it does better? This work was done by Andrzej Przebula, who was postdoc with me for a while. And in this study, people reached to a whole array of targets throughout the workspace. And, in pseudo-random order, there were 32 targets, 80% of the reachable horizontal workspace at around chest level. And what we found that was pretty surprising was when they didn't have visual information during the reaching, the non-dominant arm actually showed an advantage throughout most of the workspace. And what you have up here in the upper right hand is the average error, represented as the radius of the semicircle, for the left hand in gray and the right hand in black. And you can see that throughout most of the reachable workspace, the left hand actually was more accurate without vision. We followed this up by a study done by Brooke. Well, at the time she was Fasson, and now she's Dexheimer, and she's still in the lab as a graduate student. And we asked, does this have to do, what's the difference between 1 or 2 targets and 32 targets? And we thought, well, this might have to do with predictability. Under the case that you're making a movement with low predictability, where you have lots of movements, you don't know what the next movement is going to be, and it's a very different dynamically from maybe the other movements that you make, that you're in a less predictable condition. But if we give you sequence, if we give you 32 targets and then another 32 targets, another 32 targets in a repetitive manner, then the task becomes more predictable. And what we found is that the left arm shows a substantial advantage. Here we have speed divided by accuracy, how accurate you were at a given speed. You could look at it as, it's the inverse of that. And you can see that the right arm is much better than the left arm when things are unpredictable, but then it comes down to the left arm and even, but not statistically, a little better by the end when things are more predictable. So this led us to think about the idea of predictability being something that has to do with the right arm advantage in right-handers, or the dominant arm advantage, or the non-dominant arm advantage in left-handers. And so it led to kind of an idea that the dominant arm is pretty good with predictive control, and maybe the non-dominant arm is using something that doesn't depend on experience, and maybe something like an impedance control mechanism where one specifies a position and moves to it, like the very early forms of the equilibrium point control. So this led to, kind of more detailed hypothesis of lateralization. And what we're really wondering is, when would the non-dominant arm controller be better? It should be better under inconsistent conditions, and the dominant arm under consistent conditions. And we thought of this as mechanical conditions. So Vivek Yadav, who's now working on autonomous cars for Google, but was a postdoc with me for a while, designed this task using a robot arm in which we either gave a inconsistent field, and these are curl fields, or fields that push your hand lateral to the direction of movement, and the amplitude of the force varies with the speed that you're going, which is why if you look at these little representations of the field, if one is moving from the bottom to the top in roughly a straight line, then when you get around peak velocity in the middle of your movement, you have a larger perturbation. And then we had a consistent field, and Vivek added a little tweak to this. He thought, well, if what the dominant arm is better at is predicting aspects of impending dynamics or aspects of impending trajectory, then a consistent field that rapidly changed would be okay. And so he made the consistent field be a velocity squared field. And you can see it changes a bit faster than the velocity field. Whereas a controller, so he really tailored this to our hypothesized controllers. One that might represent the dynamics of the movement. Relax, Mark. It could be the effects of the dynamics of the movement. I'm not sure what's being represented, but that would deal with rapidly changing stuff, okay, because it's predictive. And one that is specifying apparent stiffnesses, apparent viscosities, and the result is that if we have a field that varies with speed, it should be able to modify those parameters that are position and velocity dependent fairly well. And so we predicted that the left non-dominant arm would deal better with the inconsistent field, but worse with the consistent field, and vice versa for the right arm. And that's exactly what we found. In the consistent field, this is what we call the linearity deviation, which is a measure of the curvature of the movement. The non-dominant arm did substantially worse on initial exposure and throughout adaptation, but did in the inconsistent field, the non-dominant arm actually did substantially better. They got very similar by the end, but on initial exposure, this is the baseline without exposure to the field over here, to where it says base. And then these are repetitive cycles of 8 targets. I think these cycles were actually like 2 times around 16 targets, pseudo-random order in the direction of the targets. This is a measure of mean squared jerk, where you see the same phenomena, non-dominant, worse at the consistent field, but better at the inconsistent field. So here we're finding something complementary. Whatever it is, whatever the control algorithms may be, one arm is doing better with an inconsistent mechanical and an inconsistent informational, in case of the reaching knot that I showed previously, where you have 32 targets, even though you don't have any mechanical perturbation. The non-dominant arm does better when things are unpredictable, including mechanics. And the dominant arm does better when things are predictable. All right. Let's see. Okay, there's my little thing. So again, I don't know if trajectory, efficiency, something along the lines of, as you'll see, our simulation, something that approximates optimal control, you could think of as a dominant system specialization, and the non-dominant system we think of as impedance control, the one which can take account of the effects of impending dynamics, whether internally and or externally, can make very efficient movements, but not very robust because it's predicting what's going to happen in the future, and if it's wrong, it's going to make big errors. Whereas a non-dominant system, using an impedance system, can be very robust to errors, but probably not as efficient. And this is just representations of what we're picturing this lateralization being during bilateral activities, which I'll get to in a minute. So that's kind of like the idea. And so we think the non-dominant arm is better at stabilizing, and these pictures that I showed you, you could think of a million things where you stabilize things with your non-dominant arm and you apply forces or you specify paths or whatever with your dominant arm, scissor cutting, all that stuff. So we wanted to make a task where we could test this idea, and this was done with Elizabeth Woodwich, who now is working for some exercise product company, but really did great work for a dissertation with Kelly Westlake, Joe Whitall, and me in a collaboration. And so in this task, what we did was we displaced the cursors. So this is where one hand was, this is where another hand was. We didn't want the hands to hit each other. And then we displaced the cursors so they could both start in a start position. And then your task was where your hands are together to start with, your task was to move to these different targets with one hand with a spring that's coupling your hands, a real spring that's between the hands, so that as you move toward a target with the one hand, the other hand would get pulled towards that target and you would have to stabilize. So we envisioned this as like cutting a loaf of bread or hammering a nail. You're stabilizing the act for the action that's applied with the other hand. And so what we found is represented in this slide in a number of different ways. What we found was basically the moving hand made more curvy linear trajectories if it was the left hand, straighter trajectories with the right hand, which is something that we've seen before. But the stabilizing was a very clear difference between the hands, and the thing that we really were interested in here. The left hand stabilized better and the right hand stabilized worse. And if you look at the degree to which what we call the muscle torque compensated for the spring torque, it wasn't as good compensation for the right hand, or it didn't mirror the spring torque as well for the right hand as for the left hand. And so the hand displacement, regardless of the direction that we were moving, was much worse for the right hand than it was for the left hand, or much more, I should say. Whereas the spring forces were the same because they're displacement dependent, and the displacement of the moving hand was the same in all cases. So one wasn't dealing with a higher force in either case. And then we measured either endpoint compliance or joint compliance, and we found that the compliance of the right hand, if we measured it at the endpoint, or if we measured it at the, or I should say approximated it at the elbow joint, was higher than for the left hand. Not so much for the shoulder joint, though. The thing that I want to get across is that we think that the two hemispheres are specialized for these two aspects of control, which empirically we can see. We have simulations, which I'll describe pretty soon, but we don't really know what these two aspects of control are in terms of control algorithms. But nevertheless, it might describe the lateral preferences that we tend to have for these kinds of bilateral tasks that we've seen, but not so fast. If anybody watches college football, they know Corso, he does that.
May I ask you a question on this one? So do you think that there is some inherent trade-off between those two aspects? I mean, would there be some theoretical reason why an arm that's very good at predictive control wouldn't be very good at impedance at the same time? Is there some? I have some.
Yeah. So if we, thanks for the question, and yes, I think so. So I think, for instance, if you're going to specify, as I'll show you later, simulations, like if you're going to specify a particular trajectory, say to reduce costs, if you're doing some kind of optimization, so you want an accurate, trajectory with some speed, and you want to minimize something along the lines of energy, which you can specify as, whatever you want, mean squared torque, energy, whatever, work. Then you'll get a particular trajectory profile for that. And you can specify that profile, and it'll be a low dynamic cost, high accuracy trajectory. On the other hand, if you specify let's say it's just a final position, and you let dynamics take your hand there, then you won't get that trajectory. You won't have the most efficient trajectory in terms of the costs that you've defined. If you put the two things in parallel, depending on the gains that you give them, you will have a trade-off between efficiency on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think the issue is robustness, so that when you have something that you're specifying impedance around, you have a robust system that can respond to an anticipated perturbation. So I think that's the trade-off, efficiency and robustness. And why you have them in the two hemispheres, not quite sure, but it is it's empirical findings, and it makes sense because they're complementary in this way. They can compete. but I think they contribute to both hands. One more thing I want to say is, why wouldn't we have equal representations for either from two different hemispheres or from the same hemisphere of both of these aspects of control? And I've thought about this a lot. Wouldn't we like to have two hands that can do both things just as well? And, some people will say, yeah, but, you practice through life, so you choose. That could be the case. I doubt it, though. I think it has a lot to do with cognitive costs. And I think, like, when David Rosenbaum, us, and other people have asked people to do a task, but choose a hand. And when you add that requirement of choosing a hand to do part of a task or a task, it adds around 100 milliseconds if it's a simple task like reaching in terms of reaction time. So having to decide what you're going to do with each hand can actually make you very temporally inefficient. And I think that there may be an evolutionary pressure to do things efficiently in terms of time, and maybe the distinction between the proficiencies of the two controllers and the two hands adds what we could think of as a cognitive advantage.
Bob, this is Richard Van Emmerich. As a follow-up, have you done this work on left-handers? Because to the last point, there you obviously see very often much more that they're ambidextrous, either by design or through experience. But what would be the findings in left-handers?
Yeah, and we have done some studies in left-handers. So, my concern about, a lot of times people take the point of view that you can't study handedness without studying left and right-handers, and that it's not handedness unless the two groups show the opposite patterns. And I don't take that point of view. Left-handers tend to be very, as you're saying, behaviorally more distributed across the lateralization spectrum. So you have people that look more, well, you can think of as ambidextrous, or that's not really ambidextrous. It's more distributed which hands they choose to do what tasks with. So there's a tendency to have mixed preference when people identify themselves as left-handers. So they're more of a heterogeneous group, not a very great group for studying lateralization. And this is true in terms of neural imaging also. There tends to be more of a mix in that group. So some look like opposite of right-handers, some look like they have bilateral representation, and actually with the language system, even left-handers tend to be more heterogeneous with the way that the language system is lateralized. So that being said, like, I don't think that left-handers make a great experimental complement, but at asking the question, what do they look like for these kinds of things? We have done a few tasks where we've done, I'm not talking about adaptation here, but we've looked at adaptation and transfer, and we've looked at coordination. And we see the same, we see like an opposite pattern, but it's not as disparate between hands. It's more symmetric, but it is the opposite pattern.
Thanks.
Hey Bob, another way to another possible approach would be look at all right-handers, but do things like piano playing or drumming, who are doing much more equal tasks in both arms.
Yeah, so we once, for reasons that I won't get into that are kind of funny, ended up studying fencers. And so that's the opposite. Fencers, you would think, this hand they might as well cut off, and they want to use this hand, and they say that to you. They put it like, down their pants or in their back pocket. They really don't want it getting in the way, even though there is, just to be honest, there is a strategy of training the opposite hand, and fencing coaches think that gets people really cognitively focused, and that carries over to the actual fencing hand. But I just wanted to say that for completeness because I'm an idiot. But what we found was they were actually more symmetric. And so, my thinking on that was, that's kind of weird. For these kind of tasks, they're more symmetric. And that seemed kind of weird. And the more I thought about it, I realized, but they're doing all of these functions with one hand. They're doing impedance. They're blocking. They're doing these very precise, trajectory tasks, what you could think of as force profile tasks. And so that makes me think that they're constantly recruiting both hemispheres for one hand. And so that's the thing, that's another thing that as you start to do this kind of asymmetry work, or symmetry work, whatever you want to call it, you kind of become cognizant of behavioral symmetry versus neural symmetry. You can be very neurally asymmetric and behaviorally symmetric as long as the control of each hand can recruit both hemispheres. So the more you can recruit, so I think, and so you think about it like learning in sports to kick from one side versus the other side, to use your other hand, to bat from both sides, you're probably learning to recruit more symmetrically versus rewriting the symmetry of your brain. That's the way I think about it.
Thanks.
So here we are, not so fast about this bilateral stuff. Great article from Burdett, or Burdett, I never asked him how to say his name, his lab testing this idea. And what they did was they had people hold, you could think of it as holding like a brick between hands, and then the brick vibrated, and they had to hold it and then move it. And what they found was that the dominant hand in this case had an advantage for, well, their advantage wasn't that because everything was coupled, you couldn't say one hand moved more than the other, the way I understand it, because if one hand moved, the other hand moved. But they showed greater coactivation in the right hand, and even coactivation when there was no perturbation happening. And I don't know if that's really contrary to our findings. I think in a case where the dominant hand might have to, so there, you know, two things that could happen, might have to stabilize. If we're right about these controllers, it could recruit ipsilateral controller, and I'll show you some evidence for that. On the other hand, it could be doing this whole thing predictively and saying, I know I'm going to get this thing shaking, so I'm going to really stiffen. And whether that's as effective in terms of generating impedance or not, I'm not sure that this article addressed. I haven't gone through it in depth yet. I just became aware of it like a day ago. On the other hand, we could be wrong, which is probably likely. So what's important is that our hypothesis is a model of hybrid control. So each hemisphere is contributing a unique control
Bob, Anatole would like to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Just for understanding, I don't understand how handedness is related to impedance, what you call impedance. Can you clarify?
Yeah, I'm talking about controlled impedance. So you think of it as specifying stiffness, apparent stiffness, if you will, changing the gain. I mean, as we've looked at reflexes, stretch reflexes under different conditions, changing the gain of reflexes, and specifying co-contraction in order to stabilize positionally. And then one could imagine changing also the gain of reflexes, in this case, the gamma dynamics, in order to make a system that has more apparent viscosity. So I'm talking about...
I still don't understand. The stiffness or always impedance, it's a terminology referred to both left-handed and right-handed. Why? Handedness to deal something with impedance.
So our model, and I'll show you a computation.
I don't see model. I'm sorry to say, but I don't see model because I don't see why one people are left-handed, but the other.
No, I'm not talking about left and right-handed people. I'm talking about. I'm showing you data predominantly on right-handed people, the left and right hands, and I'm saying it emerges from controlling two different aspects, specifying position you could say resistance to displacement and resistance to speed changes in one hand, and specifying a trajectory that has you could think of as a optimal solution, meaning specifying a trajectory that satisfies a reduction in whatever you conceive the costs to be. Left-handers and right-handers, I'm not sure why we have left-handers and right-handers. Leslie Rogers has come up with some interesting ideas about that in fish. But
I'm not sure Anatol's question is referring to left-handers and right-handers. I think it's referring to the differences that you're mentioning between right hand and left hand during a task.
So I'm talking about hybrid control. I'm saying that control, the way that I conceive it, given our experimental findings, is that we can specify a trajectory. We can specify a movement that we want that satisfies costs. On the other hand, we can also specify a position or a series of positions. And the two can be different. And usually when we move, and I'm going to describe this model. You might not care about models, but I'm going to describe a simplified model in which we use both of these mechanisms, the trajectory specification mechanism to begin our movements, and then the stabilization mechanism to stop our movements. So this is different, obviously, than equilibrium point control in that movement and posture are two different mechanisms. And the one which can result in movement, I mean, you can specify a posture, an end position posture, like the very early equilibrium point models, and you can get movement. But I'm picturing that these two mechanisms are located in different hemispheres and that they're combined for the control of each hand. And if we're symmetric, we're just combining them symmetrically if the behavior is symmetric. Okay. And I'm pretty sure that's not a satisfying answer to you, but I see that you don't want to address it anymore. So now, so if we're right about a bihemispheric mechanism, then if we euphemistically get rid of one hemisphere through studying stroke patients with unihemispheric damage, we should see deficits that are hemisphere specific in both arms. So in this case, we'll go back to the simple model, position, end position of a reaching movement versus trajectory of a reaching movement. And so if we have right hemisphere damage, we should have deficits in position, but not deficits in trajectory. And if we have left hemisphere deficits, damage, we should have deficits in trajectory, but not in position. And so we look at this. So we take people with relatively symmetric, groups of people with relatively symmetric middle cerebral artery lesions in the left and the right brain, and we have them make rapid movements without visual feedback to 3 different targets. And we look at their movements, and what we find is that controls for the purposes of this study at the speeds we're moving at look pretty symmetric. There are differences there, but we're not getting into those details. And the hemisphere damaged group shows very curvy linear movements if they have left damage, and much straighter movements if they have right damage. Straighter movements tend not to stop on the targets, and the curvy movements tend to stop more closely on the targets. And we quantified this. We wanted to come up with a measure that was similar for both features of movement. So we looked at variance in the beginning of movement at peak velocity and at the end of movement when you stopped. And left hemisphere damaged patients had early variance, but it became reduced at the end of movement. And right hemisphere damage patients had lower variance in the beginning, and it increased, or larger variance in the end. And that kind of, this is one of the studies. We did a whole bunch of studies where we looked at learning, and we looked at these different aspects of early trajectory features versus late position stabilization features, and it kept coming out the same. We kept getting this double dissociation. Left hemisphere damage screwed up the trajectory, right hemisphere damage screwed up the ability to stabilize at the end of movement. And that stabilization we're calling impedance control, the ability to specify and achieve a steady and accurate steady state position at the end of motion. And so I just want to throw this in here. This isn't what this talk is about, but with colleagues here, Carolee Winstein, my lab manager, Candy Menza, and David Good, a collaborator, and Hershey, we quantified ipsilesional arm coordination, and this is a measure of that using a clinical test which does a whole bunch of functional tasks, moving things from here to there, flipping cards over and all. And what you see is control subjects here with the right and left hand, all right-handed. And you can see that when you have more and more paresis of your bad hand in stroke, your good hand actually gets worse and worse. And that's more true for left hemisphere damage than for right hemisphere damage, but it's true for both. Uh-oh.
Can I ask you a question, Bob, about that?
Yeah.
So why are you attributing all the differences to the hemisphere here, especially with the severity, when someone who's had a more severe stroke obviously has other factors as well, like cognitive and slowness and learning and whatnot, that are much more complicated than just right-left?
Sure. So can some of this be due to posture? Sure. Can some of this be due to things that you think of as cognitive motor mechanisms, like apraxia? Yeah, we've actually published articles where we think that apraxia is actually a reflection of left hemisphere specialization mechanisms for adaptive motor control. And we've done that by looking at motor adaptation and learning in patients with left versus right damage. And of course, right hemisphere damage patients tend to have deficits in various aspects of cognitive and emotional control when they have middle cerebral artery damage. We acknowledge that. We've controlled for that the best we can by doing a number of different clinical tests that address those things. The relationship here between their, what I would say, functional deficits in their ipsilesional arm and the stuff that we find in the details of their kinematics of their movements have been published in other articles where we've looked at correlations between these things. We right now have an article where actually for the left hemisphere damaged patients, this is right now just submitted, for left hemisphere damaged patients, and it's by Shani Jayasinghe, who's a postdoc with me. For left hemisphere damaged patients, these ipsilesional motor deficits correspond very well with the kinematic deficits and trajectory control that I've described. But for right hemisphere patients, not so well. And so we think for right hemisphere damaged patients, maybe these ipsilesional deficits have more to do with some of the cognitive motor mechanisms. And what we're looking at is action selection and working memory for motor control mechanisms to find out why the right hemisphere damaged patients have these ipsilesional deficits, which don't seem to correspond well to the kinematic deficits that we've identified in these patients. So thank you for the question. So we've also seen hemisphere-specific deficits that fall along the same lines in the bad hand when we take patients with mild paresis. So these patients had, you could say moderate, 45 on the Fugl-Meyer, all the way up until very close to good on the perfect on the Fugl-Meyer, 60, 66. Here, 65, 64. You wouldn't say that these patients were paretic. And when they have right hemisphere damage, they have a problem achieving a final position, the right distance of their movement. And when they have left hemisphere damage, they make much more curved and much more variable direction and curvature to their movement. So falling along the same kind of distinctions, left hemisphere damage causes what we're calling trajectory deviations, more curvature, more variations in direction. And right hemisphere damaged patients, you can see all the trajectories are clustered here, but they tend to overshoot the target quite a bit, so they don't stabilize at the end position well. So our hypothesis is a model of hybrid control. So we should be able to predict this. And so we did this in a very simple model, a two-segment model with two pin joints, by having two different controllers, one which specified a final position and brought the two segments there. There was so we'd specify an equilibrium in each joint, which would correspond to the final position, and one which specified an optimal trajectory that we decided. Well, I'll show you the objective function in a minute. So we minimized energy, or at least when I say minimized, it was one of the factors in our objective function. We weighted positional error, we weighted speed error, and so the speed error was anything that wasn't zero speed, which is what you were aiming for. The position error was the difference between the final position and where you are, and the energy error is obviously cumulative energy. What you see here is for each joint summed together. So that's our optimal controller. That'll give us a trajectory. And then we combine these two to drive, and then we have the impedance controller that specifies stiffness by the difference between the final position where you are and viscosity, a factor multiplied by the final velocity should be zero at the velocity that you're going. So that's the impedance controller. That's the optimal controller. We again, this is a simple simulation of a two-segment model, and then this is our combined control. The combined control, we specify a gain for both of these controllers, which is either W or 1 minus W, so they're always opposite to each other. And this gives us the ability to switch with a relatively steep slope between an optimal controller and an impedance controller. The optimal controller we're always starting the movements with, thinking that, all right, it makes sense that you're going to first get a movement impulse and then initiate the final position stabilization controller. And what you see here is the simulated paths where the red is the equilibrium controller, and then the segue to the yellow is the time at which we switch to the final position control algorithm. And you can see the different trajectories as we switch those points along the movement. And these are actual paths made for the left hand and the right hand at these rapid reaching conditions. And you can see that the left hand corresponds to paths that switch to the final position controller earlier, and the right hand much later, or at the end of movement. And so Vivek Yadav did this simulation in a very systematic way, and you can read about that if you want in a series of 2 articles. And we show pretty good fits to the left and right arm. And if we look at the switch time relative to peak velocity, the non-dominant arm switches early when we fit the simulation to the actual movements, and the dominant arm switches late. So it kind of made sense when we envision combining these 2 controllers. Of course, they don't have to be combined in a serial fashion, but that was the easiest way to imagine this, since the positional controller needs to be the predominant controller at the end of motion when you're stabilizing position. And this, we're not the first ones to hypothesize this type of control. This has been proposed by others, including in a series of not too old articles by Bob Sainburg and Claude Guez, in which they were able to describe how one generalizes. They had a very similar control model to describe how one generalizes differently for trajectories and final position when, for instance, you have a perturbation to a trajectory versus a perturbation to a final position. They also did a kind of cool thing where they looked at generalization when you never stopped at the final position, so you went out and back, versus when you stopped. And that's what these two series of articles are, both of those paradigms. So, we're thinking, okay, maybe you do have these two types of control where you begin with something like an optimal controller and you end with something like a postural controller, and they come from both hemispheres. And maybe proprioception is important for switching between these controllers. So you need something for the signal to say, okay, I'm ready to switch, if this is really going on. And so we're going to look at human deafferentation. And I just want to describe something about these patients. How much? I don't have a timer on here. All right, tell me if I'm really close to the end. But I'm going to describe some previous studies with a dominant arm only, and then I'm going to describe studies where we look at the two arms, control the two arms in deafferentation. So the early studies that we did, and I did with my mentors, Howard Poisner and Claude Guez, we're looking at deafferented people with large fiber sensory neuropathy. We had 3 of them in the lab, which are pretty well known: Ian Waterman, Mimi Amato, and Charles Freed. Later, we got our hands on Jeanette, GL, and I'm going to show you some of that data. That was just a couple of years ago. The early work that we did, we looked at how patients without, so they're missing their large peripheral sensory fibers. In all cases, it was a post-viral episode. Nobody really knows much about the etiology of the dysfunction. It's kind of interesting that these kind of pure large fiber sensory neuropathy cases all occurred within about the same decade and on one or the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. I don't know. We haven't seen more of these cases crop up. I don't know if anybody's studying large sensory fiber neuropathy, large fiber sensory neuropathy cases in younger people. But within the same decade, this all, I don't know whether this was the same virus for all of them, but they basically look like Guillain-Barré syndrome. They lost all their muscle tone. They got really sick, got a really high fever, woke up, basically functionally paralyzed, and then they slowly regained function. Sural nerve biopsy and compound action potential analysis demonstrated a loss of large sensory fibers peripherally, nothing obvious centrally initially. I mean, of course, there's going to be adaptations, and maintenance or sustained small fibers that convey, crude touch, pain, and temperature. And so what we found was, looking at their dominant arm, that deafferented patients had difficulty specifying specific trajectories. And if we looked at the kind of curvatures that they had, and we asked, what are these curvatures caused by? They were caused by an inability to seemingly handle the interaction torques, because these were movements that were made in 2 cases, one in planar movements without gravity, 2 in movements, 3D movements with gravity, but no object interaction forces. And so the predominant non-muscular forces were gravity plus intersegmental dynamics or intersegmental dynamics. And we found that when we did these types of movements, that the control subject was able to move in all directions, regardless of the amplitude of interaction torques, which are shown in green here. So they're able to adjust their muscle torques to the impending mechanical interactions that occur between their limb segments. And we designed a task in which the same elbow movement, in this case 25 degrees out and back, had to occur in all cases. In one case, this last movement they made, the net torque, which is the I alpha term at the forearm segment, is carried completely by the interaction torque, and the muscles do nothing. And earlier movements in these other directions, the interaction torque is low and the muscle torque is doing more. So they seem to be able to account for these inertial interactions, control subjects, whereas deafferented patients, not so much. And so when they make movements across the directions, they have more and more difficulty, especially reversing their movements, when acceleration-dependent interaction torques become really big because they don't adjust their muscle actions to the impending intersegmental dynamics. And so we thought, okay, so maybe proprioception is important to provide information to be able to make predictions about the effects of dynamics in deafferented patients. And this was supported by the fact that if we did sequences in which deafferented patients moved in two directions in this case and made these big reversal errors, and then we gave them a bunch of visual information, so they got more and more information, and with vision they get better and better at being able to make straighter movements that reverse direction better, so handling these interactions. And then right after we give them vision for a while, we take vision away. They're able to sustain, obviously in a predictive manner because they have no proprioceptive feedback control in the direction they moved, but also in a direction that they never practiced with vision. So this gave us the idea that maybe what proprioception is doing is giving information so that you can do predictive control and take account of the effects of dynamics, in this case intersegmental dynamics, through predictive mechanisms. All right. So this is a left hemisphere in the right hand. So now we get to the current study. So because of the work that we've done on handedness, we thought it would be great to be able to look at what happens to both hands of deafferented patients. And so our friend Fabrice Sorlena, who used to be a postdoc with me, was able to, the year that we had the progress in clinical motor control a few years ago at Penn State, was able to bring Jeanette, who is kind of well known in the motor control research community, from Montreal down to visit our lab. And this is a figure that comes from Frege and Lamar's work. I think it's actually Frege's dissertation that shows symmetric loss of light touch and vibration, or discriminative touch and vibration. You could say 2-point discrimination, which would be this. Relatively symmetric throughout her whole body and throughout all her limbs. Okay, this is a movie that I should have started this already. This is a movie that Fabrice made based on some clinical tests that we did with GL when she was visiting our lab. And I'll just show you a little bit of this movie so you can see. You can see she's in a wheelchair. She has deafferentation throughout her legs. You can see the quality of her movements as she's trying to do this group pegboard task. She needs continuous visual monitoring. She has difficulty manipulating. She's so she's 70 years old here. She's unbelievably persistent and has a great spirit, and is actually able to do this. It's very, very difficult without the advantage of proprioception. You can see here, by the way, that the large diameter, this is a controller, a normal person. Large diameter sensory fibers are completely missing in GL. And so we had GL make a bunch of movements to 3 different targets. It seems to be what we've done a lot in our lab. Fast movements to 3 different targets. And this study was done as a collaboration with, you saw Candy on the previous page, Shani, Fabrice, and Jake Schaefer, who's graduating with his PhD in about a month from our lab. And so these are the movements that we see. I should also have Bob Scheid up here, who also was collaborating in this project and programmed this simulation, which is basically the same simulation that he did with Claude, modified a bit to reflect also the simulation that showed you from our lab. but this serial simulation of trajectory control or predictive or optimal control followed by what we call impedance control or positional specification. And so you can see here a control subject and left hand and right hand, and while there are slight differences, more curved movement here, straighter here, the difference is that these speeds are much lower. This is without vision, and this is what GL does. And you can see that these movements with the left hand go out toward the target, and she does vary the direction with target, as we've seen previously with diaphragm patients with the right hand. But then there's this oscillation at the end of target of the movement that looks a lot sort of like an underdamped spring system that just oscillates at the end point with its average position really not far from the target. And the right hand does something way different. It goes out and then it drifts, and this is something that was well known. I mean, we saw this with Rothrell's work on deafferentation, on Sain's work on deafferentation, Claude Guez's work on deafferentation. When you go out to a target and you have your eyes closed and you stop, there tends to be a slow drift when you have deafferentation. And now we see that's true for the right hand, but not so much for the left hand. These are planar movements, by the way. And so these differences are very big, where the non-dominant arm goes out. Oh, I should say, I shouldn't be saying right and left here because Jeanette is left hand dominant. The non-dominant arm goes out and oscillates, and the dominant hand goes out and then drifts. And so Shani and Bob used a very similar simulation to what I showed you previously, a serial simulation that they modified some parameters a bit to reflect these movements. And what they did was a very early switch to the positional controller with high stiffness and low damping, and they get this movement that has not so good initial direction and then oscillates around the specified endpoint, and another one which has a low stiffness or a poorly specified positional controller, low stiffness, low damping, and switch to that late in the movement. And so you get this more accurate initial direction, in this case, in our simulation, completely accurate, with this momentum-induced drift at the end of movement because of the poor postural controller that's initiated late. And so if we look at the real movements compared to the simulated movements, there is, a striking resemblance, which doesn't mean that it's this simple, but it means maybe something like this is going on. Maybe proprioception is really important to specify the switch in these controllers, and without that signal, the controller from the contralateral hemisphere is dominating the movements. And so that's what we think is going on there. So we have this model where we think that we have a dominant system that's specifying something along the lines of efficient control through something that might look like optimal control with solved objective function, and then another controller that's robust and specifies stability and position and something like apparent viscosity that has robustness to it and can deal with unpredictable conditions well, and can specify stability at the end of a reaching movement well. These are the people that we've worked with. These are the funding organizations that has helped us all the way through. And now I'm ready for your questions.
Can I jump right into questions?
Yeah.
From Gregor?
Hey, Gregor.
Yeah, thanks. It's very good to hear this. Part of this I've heard before, and finally I think I understand it. I want to talk about a conceptual issue. I have the impression that in the conceptual way how you talk about these two aspects, the predictive versus impedance, that you're shifting level a little bit. So optimal control is actually really planning. It's a method of planning. It just has that name, right, of optimal control. In other words, the plan generated by optimal control mechanisms needs usually to be still controlled. And physically controlled means bringing about the physical state, bringing about the action with an actuator. And for instance, in a robot, that's done by a servo controller. It's very stiff in robots. And that's the question, what that is in the nervous system. So in other words, the nervous system doesn't take a torque. You can't take a torque signal and bring that about. You need a controller to bring about the physical state, which we know is probably the peripheral reflex stuff. So what I think the account that you make for the dominant hand is that it is, gets a temporally well-defined command, which would be that optimal controller's output, and then it has some way of bringing that about, which is probably the peripheral reflex story that we know does that. The question then is, what is the other side of that, the impedance side of that? Because for impedance is an analogous thing. So you need to have maybe a plan for impedance as a way to react to perturbations or whatever is by updating some parameters. And then you also need to bring that physically about to make the stiffness or the viscosity. And again, for the stiffness and viscosity, I think you have hinted that modulating that certain reflex loops can bring that about. And I think what you're actually talking about as that competence of the non-dominant hand, that's something like the updating of that, the flexible updating of them. That's less clear for impedance because both seem to be of the same nature. I mean, the physical.
So I guess, So let me give you my view on this. So let's go to what I'm saying is the optimal control, right?
Well,
so first,
maybe you can stop sharing the screen at this moment so we can see each other better.
Oh, okay.
Then you can restart it at any time.
Stop share. Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, it's worse. Now I can see you. All right. So first, let's go with the whatever optimal controller. So I kind of agree with you. Yeah, I think that you have to filter the actuation through the spinal, through the spinal neuromechanical, neuromusculoskeletal system. Absolutely. Now, what exactly that means in actuation, I'm not so bold as to say that I know what the signal is. I don't reject the idea that there is proportional control of EMG. I don't think that that's the whole picture. I certainly think that reflex mechanisms contribute. Whatever the actuation is at the other end, of course, you can come up with whatever plan you have, as you said, and you can filter it through that actuation mechanism. So I agree with that. So the other mechanism, well, I really think of Prohaska's work in terms of impedance control. So on the one hand, there is something that needs to be specified, if you will, like you said, a plan. And so I should back up a minute. So I don't think either of these things is purely feed forward or purely feedback. And feed forward mechanisms have to be informed by feedback anyhow. But what I mean by not purely feed forward or purely feedback is that I think that you can instantiate control of your trajectory, and you can change your, if you will, your mind or your plan as you're going. And you can respond to unanticipated events when you're going. Lots of things can happen, and that might happen in a way that involves modulating, spinal systems that have been that have been recruited for the particular plan that you have, and continuously recruited. So an example is, some studies that we did where we looked at we perturbed the arm with a robot arm, and we did it when we popped the position of a target suddenly to different places, and it was single joint movement. And what happened was you modulated the amplitude of the stretch reflex within 100 milliseconds, because we didn't change it graded, so I don't know how quick it was, in accord with wherever you pop the target to. So it's clear that these feed-forward mechanisms that specify, actions, whatever your action is, are going to modulate spinal systems in accord with that. So I agree with that. Now the other system, I think that the concept I have is that the controller that's specifying this plan, if you will, is adapted very well for dealing with predictable aspects of mechanics and other features of the environment, like sensory features of the environment. So I think of it as a model, like you have a model of what your body and the world is going to behave like in advance. You're more tricked by changes in that model. It's not that you don't respond to it. And so I think that, you have circuits that are specialized for these kinds of specifications, carrying out a plan in accord with expectations. And then you have this other system that's basically throws expectations to the wind and specifies positions. And the reason I say impedance is because of apparent viscosity, and which I think is really important. And I don't know why we have gamma dynamics if it's not important. We have the ability to actually modulate, gamma dynamics versus gamma statics, or spring versus dashpot. And so that system I think of as being, maybe you could think of it as a cruder system, but it's a robust system. I want to go somewhere, I'm just going to specify where I am. It's like the Tamar Flash early model of equilibrium point control. I don't really care how I get there. And, or a more advanced, sequential model of equilibrium control, in which you have positions that you're specifying along the way with stiffnesses and, if you will, viscosities, I think is important, so that you can even on the way be robust to changes. I don't know. But I think the two can be different. And I think there's evidence that actually you generalize, after you learn a final position, you generalize that differently than you generalize the trajectory, which is Bob and Claude's work. And I also think that there's evidence from Ted Milner's lab and our lab that you can modulate impedance along a trajectory and in a position in surprising ways that, if you will, violate what you would think of as a natural impedance of the arm through neural commands.
Yeah, I think there's a longer discussion to have about that, but maybe not on here in this medium. I think this can be pushed further. This clarification can be pushed further, and I think we probably would converge when we do that. But maybe let's keep it.
That'd be great. I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Right. So let's do Richard, and then Marco, and then the other Richard. Now, Richard van Emmerik, you were first.
So let's call them both mechanisms. But Bob, how stable are these over time? Obviously, in your work you showed repeated trials, but let's say we're going to do this over time for longer periods of time. Would these change?
Would the specializations change?
The specialization in this case between left and right.
So like I said, one of the more perplexing things about handedness to me is how stable it is and how difficult it is for people to switch handedness, if you will. And so when people want to switch handedness, it's not so difficult to learn a new task. So if you want to, when I was in college, I broke my dominant arm. It was casted. We didn't have electronics to take notes on. So I learned to write with my non-dominant hand. I did it pretty well. I can still do it pretty well. Not as well as my dominant hand. But, to me, like I said, there's pretty good evidence that when you do that, when you try and switch dominance, that what you're doing is recruiting the ipsilateral hemisphere. with your non-dominant hand versus, re-establishing some new controller, feature in your dominant hemisphere. And the evidence for that comes from Scott Fry's lab, where they looked in a number of studies at people who had lost a dominant hand due to amputation. And they looked at them, on average about 5 years down the line. They didn't have therapy or anything to switch dominance, but some of them got some kind of prosthetic, but the prosthetic really couldn't handle the dominant limb function. So they had to functionally switch dominance. And when Scott and his at the time postdoc, who's might even be listening here, Ben Phillip, when they went and looked at the functional imaging during tracing and drawing tasks with a non-dominant arm, they found substantial recruitment of ipsilegional hemisphere compared to using the non-dominant hand in age-matched controls. So I think that handedness is pretty resistant to change, at least after some developmental age. I think these specializations in the brain are probably pretty stable, but our ability to recruit ipsilateral hemisphere so that we can make one hand look more like the other hand in its specialization, I think is susceptible to training. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for your talk. I have a quick question or comment about armness versus handedness. The literature I'm familiar discuss, that you talked about at the beginning, tend to focus mostly on what we do with the fingers and the hand, even though, of course, forearm and shoulder muscles support, finger motion, etc. So, given the mechanical differences between the arm and the hands, I wonder. I know this is an old thing that we discussed a few years ago at Penn State as a potential collaboration. We'll get to it one day, but I wonder how much of that specialization that you discussed spills over to hand muscles, and in particular when it comes to dexterous movements, where you can still see, even if you block the arm, if you want to come out with an absurd example, you can still imagine finger muscles being involved to do more stable, stabilizing kind of action versus more dynamic kind of tasks. So do you have any sense, I don't know if you have any data, but do you have any sense about the extent to which, another absurd example, the level of specialization kind of stops at the wrist, and then because of different descending pathway and functions and mechanics, you may see a completely different story when it comes to the fingers?
Well, we just published a paper looking at very simple wrist movements and saw massive differences. So, but we're looking at different features, because when you get down to the wrist, like when we were looking at, as upper arm, forearm movements and intersegmental dynamics, in these long segments become the big thing that you have to coordinate with if you want to specify something. And, at the wrist, what we did was radial ulnar deviation, which actually, if you do this, you'll find it's hard to isolate in your non-dominant hand, even though you don't do this every day. Your non-dominant hand has a problem. And the reason is because you've got these, especially the carpi muscles, which have multiple axes, multiple moment arms in flexion, extension, and in radial ulnar deviation. And you have to coordinate them precisely so that, if you want to make a planar movement versus bleeding into flexion extension. And this even becomes more of a problem because the more you flex, your flexor carpi muscles actually become more flexors the more you're flexed. So it's a mechanical positive feedback loop. So, we showed these massive differences between, the proficiency for doing this with the dominant and non-dominant arm. But this isn't intersegmental dynamics, it's intermuscular dynamics. I think that intuitively, I'd say the things that I feel most handed about isn't reaching, it's manipulation. And I don't believe that science, done right to look at this is going to violate that intuition. So I think it's just what we look at. And going back to the shoulder and elbow, the earlier studies that I was talking about, I think it was the resolution of looking at the task and the tasks. In the lab, it's really hard to instrument and quantify things that are, that some people describe as difficult. And so a lot of times the tasks that we do, if you will, are easier than the distinction between the controllers. And I think that's our problem. It's a matter of a combination of resolution and the right tasks. I don't think we're less-handed distally. I think we're probably more-handed.
Okay, thank you.
Richard Nichols.
Great talk, Bob, as usual. I think I missed something along the way, and it's probably my fault, but I'm trying to deal with the issue of the control of interaction torques and the role of these two mechanisms that you're talking about. So I was thinking, probably naively, that if the non-dominant arm, which is good at stabilization, probably takes advantage of a lot of proprioceptive feedback, which is kind of my bias, I guess, and that maybe the control of interaction torques would probably be in the realm of impedance control. And then as you were talking, I tried this little exercise. I shook my hand back and forth and looked at how well I could stabilize my elbow joint, which is kind of analogous to the Judy Smith and Ron Zernike paw shake thing that they do with cats, right? And then I did it with my dominant arm, and I was much better able to control my elbow with my dominant arm than my non-dominant arm. Now, in full disclosure, you're well aware that my dominant arm is my bad arm, right? In your terms. So that may be a confounding factor, but how would you?
No. I don't think so. So I think that what you're dealing with, so the great work by, Gail and Melissa and Ron and Judy on the paw shake demonstrated that for some actions, interaction torques are accommodated into spinal circuits for functional behavior.
Right.
So I totally get that, and I think that that's really cool. And you probably may or may not be. So if you remember the mechanical analysis of their work, the optimal paw shake is one in which the distal accelerations are the highest.
Yes.
So it doesn't, what we think of as coordination kind of goes out the window, and we want this whipping movement. This isn't stabilizing proximally, right? It's helping with the whipping movement. And that doesn't mean that the cat's going to be able to integrate these types of mechanical interactions to specify a movement to throw a rock, right? Because it's got these built-in things, because these things are specifying a particular important task for them that has been built in, in my sense, it's like scratch, Sherrington's scratch reflex, like locomotion, so I think that those tasks that are built in to be fairly automatic, these things can be built into spinal circuits. And then just like every other reflex, when we want to, because when you think of control of interaction force, I agree with Mark that I don't really think that, we have a controller that controls interaction forces. I know you don't either. We have a controller that wants an outcome. And interaction forces are part of the dynamics that's involved with the mechanical system.
Right.
And so sometimes people think, and people talk about this compensating interaction torques. Well, most of the time, like if you say this to Art Quo, who gets really excited about the passive elements of gait, which are interaction torques, he'd be like, what? Compensate them? Are you freaking crazy? We use them. So, I think that a controller that wants to be efficient sometimes wants to incorporate the mechanical interactions that arise from the body and the environment, and sometimes doesn't. And if we have circuits in the spinal cord that do things like paw shake, I don't know what we have, that will, or locomotion or anything, that will, sort of either dampen it or take account of, depending on the circuits, these interactions to accelerate or decelerate the limb. I think that my view is that the higher centers can incorporate those into its plan. The same way that, like, I probably incorporate the ATNR into looking and reaching. those circuits. Or as Lundberg showed, I incorporate the flexor withdrawal into walking.
Right, but I wasn't trying to make a distinction between higher centers and the spinal cord, because even in the spinal cord, the CPG and the reflex circuitry have both trajectory control and impedance control all down there in the spinal cord. So I'm trying to figure out. So, for example, if you were to take the patient GL and ask her to do that slicing motion with her two arms, presumably she has some vestige of handedness left. I mean, I'm just wondering if she would be able to regulate, if the interaction torques would be slightly better regulated on her previously dominant arm because of the vestiges of trajectory control that she would have, or whether, I'm trying to see if when you're dealing with high acceleration type movements, I'm trying to get a handle on whether the trajectory control system or the stabilization control system is going to be able to help you out better.
Right. I know, with GL, is everybody freezing, by the way, or is it just at my end?
No, people are not freezing, and you are not freezing.
Wait, I'll turn up the heat. I'll turn up the heat.
I don't mean temperature.
Let's all go to Phoenix.
Wonder if I could react to that. I think that this is what I was trying to get at could play a role here, in that if you think of the impedance side as being something more like yielding, the actuator has its impedance at any moment in time, right? And the spinal cord could be very close to that. But if you think of what characterizes the non-dominant hand, it's this ability of modulating something like an equilibrium point, and that is something like yielding to adapt the impedance to the appropriate point. Then there is an inner conflict with the strategy of the dominant hand, because if you have a good model of interaction torques and you want to use it, you actually have to not yield, because the interaction torques are going to perturb. And you have to not update your plan to yield to that. So the difference might not be that the non-dominant hand doesn't have that plan that compensates for interaction torques. It might be that it yields to the interaction torques because it is specialized in that sort of yielding, if I may use that word, to update its current plan to deal with, to soften its response to perturbations.
Okay, I think Anatole was the next one who raised the hand. So Anatole, unmute yourself and tell us.
Can you?
You're already unmuted.
I'm unmuted. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment about putting study of handedness in some context of because at the level of mechanics, you can describe whatever you want. Okay? Of course, there is symmetry in terms, but the major question, I think, why some people left-handed, but the other people right-handed? And I would like to suggest that referent control imply that neurons, motor neurons, work in a spatial frame of reference. Let's consider, let's try to, from this point of view, to explain why one guys have left hand dominant and the other right hand. let's consider frame of reference X, Y, Z. Okay, you know that there are two types of frame of reference. One is left-handed, left frame of reference, and the other right. So, to clarify, if you have X, Y, Z, and you look from Z axis on X and Y, you see in one case the rotation of X, Y axis is counterclockwise, and left frame of reference rotation from X to Y is opposite. So in process of development, the system select frame of reference. Okay, for single joint motion, it doesn't matter. You can take left system coordinate in three-dimensional space or right, and you can walk in this frame of reference. But when you need to also accomplish bilateral movement, okay? And at some point of development, because of body symmetric structure of the body, you need to shoot a single frame of reference for both arms. In this case, it's like a selection between gender, so the system, at certain point, the system selects in what frame of reference the system should produce bilateral movement. And so, and that's why it's very genetically or some occasional environmental conditions, system select one system coordinate or the other. So from here, if you select one system coordinate, say left, you have asymmetry in brain, you have asymmetry in motion. So that's from, and I think the study of handedness should start from definition, from experimental verification in which is the system produced by manual and unilateral movement. That's my comment. So it's a framework which allows you to clarify and advance the research in handedness. I will stop at this. Okay, it's a challenging task, but I think it's a very mentally possible to start from this and or proceed in the direction, because and this is solid theoretical framework which allows you to move forward.
So, let me ask you, Anatol, I'd like to follow up on that with something. So let's say that we have a right-hander and we've got a right-hand frame of reference. So are you saying presumably if you have a right-hand frame of reference in a right-hander, that the left hand will behave differently because it's not in its natural frame of reference? Like there's a discrepancy?
Yes, because it creates, because of the structure of the body, if you supposed to make preference for one hemisphere versus the other, field skilled motion preference for one hand versus the other. And that's with this emerging property.
I think it would be sounds to
I want to follow this up. It sounds like this is this falls under what I was calling global dominance, which is that one hand has a disadvantage for everything because of that. And what I showed you is evidence that
not necessarily for single joint movement. For single joint movement, maybe left hand, left arm is better.
But what we find is mechanical conditions.
By manual motion, it's essential that the system work asymmetrically. Because of
I get that. I'm just saying that, from our point of view, we've ended up doing studies that have revealed that the left arm has an advantage for unpredictable mechanical conditions and for unpredictable
I'm sorry, Bob. I don't want to discuss the problem of handedness in terms of time because it's so remote. Mechanics doesn't give you any clue to how motion is controlled. It's a physics, and from you start from the very beginning. I hope Mark me.
Well, let's kind of maybe let me say a few words to summarize a few things, and maybe not related to control with referent coordinates, but what's been missing so far for me is the word stability, which I think is crucial for what Bob has been telling us. So one arm shows highly stable straight trajectories, but cannot ensure stable steady state at the end. The other arm shows not so stable hand trajectories, but pretty good stability of a steady state. So I've been discussing it with Bob, but I think that the language of uncontrolled manifold here would be very, very useful to make specific models and see whether one arm is, or one hemisphere is specialized for high stability of steady states, and as a consequence, cannot stabilize fast trajectories. And the other one is very good for stabilizing trajectories, but as a consequence cannot stabilize steady states because these things compete. And we've seen, we ran a few studies, and Bob are aware of those studies that suggest that yes, the left arm has better synergies without any movement. These are force production isometric tasks. And left arm has an advantage in steady state components of such tasks, and the right arm has advantage in preparation to fast action and during fast action. But now, I think, Bob, I think to be fair to our participants who wrote you 16 questions over chat, we should allow you to get through those. If we still have time and energy after you are done with the 16 questions, we may continue. So I shut up, Bob, and please handle the questions.
Bob is still on the first slide. Is he aware of this? Yes. What about ambidextrous people? Do they have similar findings? How are these findings? Okay, in a damaged brain like CP. Neuroplasticity, damaged brain, CP. Okay, I'll answer this quickly. I don't know about ambidextrous people. I've never seen one. I'm skeptical that they actually exist. What I heard is cases in which people have been able to do a highly skilled task with both hands many times in different ways, if you look at them, like the pitcher for the Yankees a few years ago that pitched with his right and left hand and with completely different patterns. I've heard of surgeons doing right and left hand surgery. My question that, being able to switch the instruments from one hand to the other. I don't know if these people are truly ambidextrous. My prediction about ambidextrous would be that it wouldn't be at a high level, because I think that if you will, the number of neurons available If you're going to have everything represented in each homologous region in each hemisphere, you're going to have less neurons available, but that's maybe just a simplistic way of looking at it. What I've seen is mixed handedness, where people say they're ambidextrous. They can write with one hand, and they can use a fork with the other, and they can throw with the other, and that kind of thing. So I don't know, but there's probably two forms of ambidextrous. One is you're lateralized neurally, and you've learned, like our fencers that I mentioned before, you're able to do really symmetric behaviors because you can recruit both hemispheres for each hand fairly symmetrically. And the other is that you're not symmetric neurally, and so you have less neurons to do everything with, and the result is that you're less dexterous, if you will, and that's the case for many neural disorders. They're less dexterous, and they don't establish consistent handedness. So I don't know if any of that's true. I'm just BSing there, according to what I think. Neuroplasticity, I hate that word because I think that it's minimally relevant to real life, and especially in damage. But nevertheless, it certainly exists. It's certainly there. And I mentioned the idea that it's really hard, or the findings, I should say, that it's really hard to switch handedness. There's not a lot of plasticity in the system. When people do switch, the most pure situation seems to be you lose a dominant hand peripherally and you have to switch. I call it pure because you've got an intact nervous system, and people tested 5-10 years down the road are not commensurate in their skill with, like on average, with people that are age-matched controls using their dominant hand, people who have presumably switched with a non-dominant, and the neural activation profiles are quite different. CP, I don't really know. I guess what you're probably driving at is it possible that somebody could be genetically right-handed? Genetics play a strong role in handedness. Is it possible to be right-handed, but then to have a neonatal stroke and now have your paretic hand be what would have been your dominant hand? I don't really know, and I don't know when. I know that there have been claims that you can predict handedness from in utero behavior, but I imagine there's critical periods for handedness, and I don't really know at what point it becomes very difficult to switch or impossible to totally switch. I hope that answered your questions. Daniela, I was curious to know whether specific brain networks would be more associated to dominant versus non-dominant features of reaching. E.g., stronger involvement of brainstem and frontoparietal networks for the dominant hand, or top-down for dominant control versus bottom-up for non-dominant. Great question. I don't know. I do know that when we've looked at, we've tried to kind of eke out in a really simplistic way the functional neuroanatomy of these systems by looking at stroke patients, and now we're doing brain stimulation work to try and get more specific with it. But what we find is that the left posterior parietal cortex is really important for doing what we're picturing being this predictive thing, at least for learning predictive control over trajectory. And it looks like being able to stabilize at the end point at dorsolateral prefrontal cortex seems to be very important. And if you have that lesion, you have problem on the right side. I'm sorry. You have problems with that. So it looks like they do recruit these specializations recruit different brain networks, not that surprisingly. Although we've looked at it very simplistically, not with a network model. How does it work in professional piano players who must be able to control precision? So I think I'm going to go back to, so basically like, what about all those things where people learn to do tasks with their non-dominant hand as good or better or different than their dominant hand? And I think it's very similar to our fencers who became very symmetric just by practicing predominantly, at least with their dominant hand, like intensely. I think it's a matter of hemisphere recruitment. So I think that probably if you look at musicians, you're going to find out that their using their non-dominant hand for things that we think of as dominant, and they're recruiting their ipsilateral hemisphere a lot more. Maybe not. Maybe they've rewritten things. Maybe their brains look a lot different because of plasticity. Biomechanical universe. Is there any parameter that could explain dynamic or impedance as separated function? I don't know what that means. I guess dynamic and impedance, trajectory and position, stabilization of rapid changes, or stabilization of steady state position. I mean, I think all of these are analogs of something that we don't really know what the controller is doing. We can see these things being different, but I'm using language that jives with the way I picture control, which is probably a little bit more similar to the way I sit down and do a simulation on a computer than what our brain really does. But I don't know what you mean with parameter. I mean, when we have these two things separate in our simulations, one parameter is important is how much are you mixing them and how early are you mixing these two modes of control. Sorry that I'm not really answering you. Sorry, I have my mouse is upside down. There we go. Oops. Raquel Gomezin, your opinion. If we train a patient with hemiparesis due to stroke to perform an object manipulation movement with a non-dominant hand, would it be difficult to achieve the same performance of the dominant hand? So I guess this is train a patient with hemiparesis. So let's take not a patient and say, if you train something in one hand, whether it's dominant or non-dominant, will it transfer to the other hand? And as everybody here knows, there's been lots and lots of studies, and it seems to depend on what you train. And nobody really knows at this point why things transfer, how much things transfer, or what things transfer, I would say. There's a lot of controversy in this area because there's been so many different paradigms where people have looked at transfer between the hands. One of the kind of cool controversies going on now is that our friend David Ostry from Montreal in Connecticut, in terms of his research, had published some work that suggested that the only aspect of adaptation paradigms that transfers between the hands is explicit components. So when you're fully aware of an error, and you're fully aware and you can actually talk about what you're doing, that part transfers. But then when you do the task, you let it creep, the perturbation creep up slowly so people are never aware that they adapt, you don't see transfer. And there's been a number of papers recently that have shown the opposite result. So I'm going to just stay agnostic with this one. I think there is interlimb transfer. We've done a lot of it. We think that what you transfer depends on what you're challenging, whether it's the left or the right hemisphere mechanisms that you're challenging in the task. But so far, there's some evidence for that in our work on visual motor transfer, but there's also contradictory evidence out there. So I have to stay agnostic with that one and say the jury's out. In terms of stroke, whether you can get interlimb transfer and stroke, and you know, I see Monica here. Monica has actually shown some interlimb, right, transfer effects in a number of cases. Actually, the early stuff you were doing, you were interfering with transfer when you did like sequence learning and stuff with particular types of stimulation. I mean, I think there's transfer. I think we don't understand a lot about what is transferred, how much is transferred, under what conditions, and why. And in stroke, it's very difficult because a hemiparetic patient may have damage to different parts of the brain that may be very important in the transfer. So, or may not. Please, one question about this is from Fabrice. I'm imagining that Fab's 23 is Fabrice. Who are likely older adults. Did Bob see a reduction of symmetry, as in the fencers, compared to young healthy participants? Fabrice, I'm very upset that you asked this question, and the reason is because, again, I have to answer like the first one. We actually showed, so there's evidence from cognitive tasks. Roberto Cabeza, who does really wonderful cognitive science work, has shown that that if you take a lateralized function, like for instance, solving a spatial maze task that involves working memory, right? That kind of sequential maze task, that incorporates the right frontal cortex in younger people. In older people, they lose neurons in the right frontal cortex, and what they apparently do is recruit the left frontal cortex, which has similar circuits, a lot more, and they do this for a really long time, and that compensates for the loss of these lateralized circuits, and so they maintain their behavior until they get really old, and then they lose that behavior. So his hypothesis is that you recruit more symmetrically as you get older because you turn those homologous circuits that were doing presumably something a bit different into assisters as you lose neurons in the lateralized circuit, if that makes sense. And we wanted to see if we would get the same thing, so we looked at older adults, and actually what we saw in one of our studies with older adults is more symmetric transfer, and then what we saw in another study in older adults, we did that spring task with both hands, and we saw that older adults actually became more asymmetric in the behavior. So, and other people, it's also a mishmash out there. You get some studies and some contexts that show greater asymmetry, and some cases that show reduced asymmetry depending on the task with aging. So I have to again say, I don't know. The jury's out on that one. Great questions, though. A lot of work needs to be done. Nikita, at what point in human development do you think the predictive and stabilizing control functions begin to develop? Okay, so this is while I don't know, I at least have a better guess here. So handedness is usually assessed by preferences for different unilateral tasks, or preferences for doing a bilateral task, like in the Edinburgh inventory, holding a broom with your dominant or your non-dominant hand down, or you don't have a preference for that. Typically, by 24 months old, children have very consistent handedness. We did a study that we never published because I'm an idiot. I was working with somebody who did parent-child emotional interaction work, and she was using Legos. And so she had all these films, and Legos is a task to work with the parent and child. And I was able to find me and this student, who was an undergraduate student, searched through all this stuff and found these cases where the Legos were symmetrical in front of the 24-month-old, and there was no parental person around, and they were along with the Legos. And then from those cases, she quantified the degree to which they used one hand to stabilize and one hand to place, to push, to do things that we consider to be more what the dominant hand does. And what she found out is 80% of the 15 or 16 kids always did those consistent functions, always meaning most of the time, were consistent with using their right hand for the pushing and placing stuff and their left hand for stabilizing. And then 2 people were opposite to that, or 20% of the people were opposite to that, 2, 3, or whatever it was. We didn't publish it because at the time I thought that we're just looking at things on videotape, and I didn't realize how valid everything we did was, and I feel really bad about that, especially for the undergrad student. So I think by 24 months it's definite, but there have been studies in utero that have shown differential use of the hands for holding and sucking and stuff like that. So I don't know how early. I'm imagining it's a critical period. Okay, Daniela, in your experiments, participants do not typically see their arms, correct? Is there any? So there's a difference when you see your arm. So what's the difference between no vision in the symmetry? With visual feedback, you see a lot more symmetry in reaching movements, typically. And when you take visual feedback away, you see the emergence of greater asymmetry. With visual feedback, you don't get pure symmetry, you get the same kind of trends, but it does reduce the asymmetry. And in the task where you have vision and you've got like tons and tons of targets that I described as being kind of unpredictable, the dominant hand becomes better at that task much quicker within the first few trials. So presumably vision does a lot to help you with making the kind of predictions that we think the dominant hand does. Daniela. Something else that came to my mind is related to an imprecise body scheme for non-dominant hand. Would that make some sense? I guess it depends on what you think of body scheme to the degree that it's a cognitive emotional thing, maybe not, to the degree that it's some kind of representation of the musculoskeletal system and how it responds to whatever the commands are you send to it. I agree with that. And I think that from that point of view, the imprecise musculoskeletal representation, if that's what we have, could be thought of as a perturbation, and so specifying steady state position would be robust in the way that I'm suggesting to that imprecision. So I think that makes sense if you want to call that body scheme. Bernstein School by Bob Sainburg, does hemisphere function lateralization origins intrinsic gait asymmetry? I think this means does lateralization relate to gait asymmetry? And I wonder, I don't know. I used to talk to Vladimir Zatsiorsky about this, and my friend Steve Piazza, both who study posture and to some degree gait. Vladimir didn't do as much gait work, I think. But we talked about posture, Vladimir and I, about the idea of a rambling and trembling trajectory, and maybe the non-dominant system would be kind of a underdamped spring, and the dominant system would be an overdamped weak spring, and you would get differences in rambling and trembling because of that. And I've talked to Steve about the idea that maybe we do tend to rely on one of our legs for more of the propulsive aspect of locomotion and steering, or at least that's what I've heard people in gait analysis suggest. Maybe it corresponds and maybe it doesn't to the arm things. I've seen some studies where people have asked people to do arm things with their feet. So like write their name in the sand and stuff like that, draw pictures. And I just think that's kind of unfair because you're just looking at another effector doing the same function. And so the fact that that corresponds to arm-handedness doesn't really get to the issue of whether leggedness corresponds to arm-handedness. The YouTube channel seems dead. It has changed the link. Got it. It lost the past link. The right and left leg involvement during upright posture. I think this is kind of like what I was just saying. Upright standing. So, I don't know. Like I was thinking along the lines of what information each controller wants. And maybe there's like this differential tuning through gamma motor, gamma statics and dynamics. So the system that wants to predict things about dynamics might want more feedback about velocity, and the other one might want more feedback about stiffness. And if you were to, this is crazy thought, but if you were to, in some kind of consistent way, modulate your gammas in that way, then your dominant system would be more of a damper, and your non-dominant system, in terms of the reflex responses, and your dominant system more of a spring, underdamped spring. And so the thought there was maybe if you stand in one leg during the other, if you're in your non-dominant system and it's more of a spring and less of a damper, then you would do a lot of trembling and not a lot of rambling. You would stay in place but oscillate a lot. And the other one, where you have a weak spring and more of a damper, you might move around a lot more because the weak spring wouldn't stabilize you in space, and because you have a larger damper, you get less of the high frequency oscillations. That's something I used to talk to Vladimir about, but we never checked it. Okay, do we know what animal species dominance emerged in for the first time? This is a really cool topic. And animals do show dominance. And
well, I understand that you're excited, but also keep in mind that we are kind of 18 minutes past the time. So try to be a bit less excited and more to the point.
Okay, two animals with very clear and well-studied species-specific handedness are parrots and chimpanzees. Other species have individual handedness that apparently hasn't emerged into species-specific handedness because presumably it's functional, but it hasn't emerged as a genetic component of their, as a genetic determinant for handedness hasn't emerged among the species. If you want more of the stuff on chimpanzees, Bill Hopkins down in Atlanta has done a lot of work on that, both in the wild and in captivity. In professional ballet dancers, there's always a preferred leg for gesture, and the other is preferred for unipodal standing. Cool. But in the literature, leggedness is not documented. It actually is, but everybody defines it differently. I think, again, intuitively, I think we all have leggedness, or at least most of us, but it hasn't been studied very well. Bob, great talk. I agree. Sorry I have to run. Sorry. That's from Marco. Footedness is well documented. There are tests of footedness, yeah. Usually people are less asymmetrical in leg action than arm action, but there's dominance. I agree with that. Mark Latash said that. Lewis, Matt, sorry, I realized I made a mistake. I don't think it makes sense. I'm going to stop this, Daniela. Is that okay? I would like to know if it is possible to extend these concepts of lateralization, of reaching to body schema. It's an interesting question. I think we kind of talked a little about that. Thanks, Bob. Okay, bye, Mindy.
Sorry, I have another meeting.
Okay. I think we're done.
You. I gotta go. Sorry.
All right. Thank you. Sorry for taking so long. I can't hear you, Mark. You're muted.
Yes, now I'm not. The important thing is, of course, is to drink to your health. So thank you very much for the talk, for answering questions, for being patient with everybody, for not cursing.
Great.
Yeah,
that's really great discussion.
That's terrible.
So, cheers to you.
Cheers.
Cheers to Bob.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Now we can say proper goodbye. Great seeing you all. This Saturday we are going to listen to Monica.
All right. See you on Saturday.
Very good.
Hope we can talk more, Gregor.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye-bye. Bob, I'm gonna send to you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Gregor.
Bye, Gregor.
Bye.
Okay, thank you everyone. I'm gonna upload a full video file because some of you had some problems with the broken links, and I have recorded all the presentation. in just one full video. So as soon as I have it ready to upload them, I will do, and then you can see whatever you have lost. Anyway, thank you. See you on Saturday. Monica Perez is gonna talk. She's going to show her experiences on Evlit Lab. Thank you for everyone. Have a safe and nice week. Bye-bye.